Welcome everyone to the Newburyport Literary Festival. My name is Jennifer Entwistle and I am the co-director of the festival. This is our 16th year of bringing authors and readers together, and it's actually our biggest year ever. We've got over 100 panelists speaking this weekend, and that means there's something for everyone. So I hope you've checked out the schedule and picked out your whole lineup for the next 2 days. We are using Zoom webinar, which means that you will be able to hear the panelists, but we will not be able to see or hear you. So we encourage you to use the chat for discussion, and there's a Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Please use the Q&A for questions for Michael today, because we will be doing a Q&A session at the later in this event. My final piece of housekeeping is that we would ask you to support your local bookseller. We have two partnering booksellers with the festival, Jabberwocky Bookshop here in Newburyport, Massachusetts, and the Bookshop of Beverly Farms. So I will put links to those two bookstores in our chat window once we get started. Of course, if you have a favorite independent bookstore, then by all means, please buy your festival books from them. Today is Independent Bookstore Day, so we want to make sure that we're keeping our bookstores alive. Now, I have the honor of introducing Michael. Michael Blanding is a Boston-based investigative journalist whose work has appeared in the New York Times, Slate, Boston Magazine, and many other publications. He's the author of The Map Thief, the gripping story of an esteemed rare map dealer who made millions stealing priceless maps, which was a New York Times bestseller and an NPR Book of the Year. He's also the author of The Coke Machine, the dirty truth behind the world's favorite soft drink. A former journalism fellow at Brandeis University and Harvard Law School, he has taught feature writing at Tufts University, Emerson College, and with Grub Street Writers. Welcome, Michael.
Terrific. Well, thank you for that great introduction, Jen, and really pleased to see so many participants at the festival today, at least for those here in the Boston area. It's a beautiful day outside, so I'm really genuinely honored that you've chosen to spend it inside with me and the other authors here talking about books, although perhaps you're outside talking about books as well. And I will do my best to make it entertaining for you. So I'm really pleased to be back here at the Newburyport Literary Festival. I was here to present my last book a number of years ago, and I know what a great, engaged literary crowd the festival draws. So I am just going to read a short passage from my book for a few minutes to start. It comes right from the introduction, so there's not a whole lot that you need to know going in, but the title of my book is North by Shakespeare, A Rogue Scholar's Quest for the Truth Behind the Bard's Work. And as the title of this presentation says, it's all about searching for Shakespeare and searching for the truth about Shakespeare and finding it in maybe some unusual places that are will raise some new questions perhaps, but also provide some answers to some of the greatest works of literature in the English language. So, all right, I'm just going to start here, and I'm going to read a passage right from the introduction. It was the greatest party of Elizabeth's reign. 19 days of gut-busting feasts, minstrel performances, bear baiting, Italian acrobats, and jaw-dropping fireworks. All of it was designed for a single purpose, to woo a queen. When Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, planned the festival at his estate of Kenilworth Castle in July 1575, he was getting desperate. After 15 years of vying for Queen Elizabeth's hand, he was no closer to a promise of marriage than when he'd begun. The Kenilworth Festival was his last-ditch attempt at winning the Queen's affections, and Leicester spared no expense to impress her. As the party raged, nobles and gentry from across the realm, as well as commoners from the countryside, guzzled 40 barrels of beer and 16 barrels of wine a day, as they pursued wanton encounters in the surrounding woods and fields. Leicester kept his eyes on the Queen, anxiously watching for signs that she was enjoying the elaborate masks and other entertainments he had dreamed up in her honor. On several nights, Leicester unleashed fireworks displays created by an Italian pyrotechnician over a man-made lake that lapped against the western wall of the castle. The spectacles lasted for hours, including dazzling dragons, fighting dogs and cats, and rockets that seemed to shoot out of the water itself. A contemporary observer described them as a blaze of burning darts flying to and fro, gleams of stars coruscant, streams and hail of fiery sparks, of such intensity that the heavens thundered, the waters surged, the earth shook. Another night, the Earl staged a giant water pageant as Elizabeth was making her way across the long bridge over the lake. An actor dressed as the sea god Triton rode across the water to her on a mechanical mermaid. Sounding a trumpet in the shape of a whelk, he commanded the seas to still, shouting, "You waters wild, suppress your waves and keep you calm and plain." After his speech, another actor dressed as the fabled Greek musician Arion serenaded her from atop a 24-foot-long mechanical dolphin. Music emanated eerily from the dolphin's belly, where an ensemble of musicians had been secreted inside. There's no record of how the queen received the performance, whether she stood stony-faced or smiled and clapped with joy, or felt a rise of love in her heart for the man who had gone to such extravagant lengths to please her. But the moment has been immortalized after a fashion, in William Shakespeare's most beloved play, A Midsummer Night's Dream. In one scene, Oberon, king of the fairies, reminisces to his underling Puck, while in a jealous fit over the fairy queen Titania. "Thou rememberest, since once I sat upon a promontory, and heard a mermaid on a dolphin's back, uttering such dulcet and harmonious breath that the rude sea grew civil at her song, and certain stars shot madly from their spheres to hear the sea maid's music," he says to Puck. "That very time I saw, but thou couldst not, flying between the cold moon and the earth, Cupid, all armed. A certain aim he took at a fair vestal throned by the west, and loosed his love shaft smartly from his bow as it should pierce 100,000 hearts." For more than a century, those lines have been read as an allusion to Leicester, who shot a love arrow at his own vestal, England's famous Virgin Queen Elizabeth, at a pageant complete with dolphin, mermaid, and fireworks. It's less clear how Shakespeare, then a boy 11 years old, could have witnessed the spectacle, or why he would have included it in a play written around 1595, some 20 years after the event. In his book, Will and the World, Harvard professor Stephen Greenblatt allows that it is certainly conceivable that Shakespeare's father may have taken him from their home in Stratford-upon-Avon, 14 miles away, to see the display. If so, then perhaps Shakespeare stood with his father upon a promontory overlooking the lake to catch a glimpse of the entertainments, and perhaps the sight made such an impression on him that he remembered it for the next 2 decades, and perhaps he found a moment to work it into a play performed before the queen to remind her of her youthful wooing by her favorite courtier. Those are a lot of perhapses. It's not the only explanation, however, for how the Kenilworth water pageant could have inspired Shakespeare's comedy. The playwright could have heard a report from someone who attended or read about it in a letter circulated after the event. Or there is another possibility. Perhaps another person wrote those lines, someone who attended the event as a guest and witnessed the pageant firsthand. I first heard the name Thomas North in October 2015. I had been invited to Lafayette College in Easton, Pennsylvania, to give a lecture about a book I'd written about a thief of rare maps. The weather was unseasonably warm and the foliage was in full array, with the spectacular red maple lighting up the picture window of the library lecture hall. Afterward, the lecture sponsors, English professor emerita Juneschluter and her husband Paul, a literature scholar, took me to a dinner reception. Over a pasta buffet, they introduced me to a scholar named Dennis McCarthy, a confident 53-year-old who looked a decade younger than his age. McCarthy had attended my lecture with his adult daughter, Nicole Golovsky, and only later did I learn that the two positioned themselves around the last remaining seat so that I would sit next to one of them. McCarthy immediately pulled me into conversation, asking me about my book and telling me about his own research. Before long, we were spiritedly discussing maps and geography. As the reception wound down, he invited me to continue talking over drinks with his daughter and her fiancé. It took me half a second to decide. I was alone on a Thursday night in a small college town, and the thought of going back to my B&B by myself was infinitely less appealing. I figured I could have a few drinks and enjoy a conversation. I had no idea how this chance meeting would start me down a path to trace a literary mystery that I'd follow along with McCarthy for the next 5 years. We headed to the College Inn Tavern, a bar with old sports memorabilia framed on the walls, go Leopards, and students and locals drinking liquor from plastic cups. We sat at a chipped wooden high top, straining to hear each other over the impromptu karaoke of nearby patrons. I don't know whose idea it was to order martinis, but I was a bit foggy by the time McCarthy finally leaned across the table and told me he had a story for me. You know how Shakespeare used other sources to write his plays? McCarthy asked over the din of amateur Bon Jovi. Sure, I replied, trying to remember anything about Shakespeare's sources from my first year college class. Well, I found a source no one ever knew about before, he said. This unknown manuscript, he continued, was a treatise by a 16th century courtier named George North. The work, he claimed, influenced some of Shakespeare's greatest plays, including Richard III, Macbeth, and King Lear. But Shakespeare never read the manuscript, McCarthy continued, as I struggled to follow his argument through a haze of classic rock and booze. Instead, George's relative, Sir Thomas North, had used it to write his own plays. Oh, he is one of those, I thought to myself, a conspiracy theorist who thought Shakespeare didn't write Shakespeare. But McCarthy hurriedly added that, in fact, he believed the Bard of Avon wrote every word attributed to him during his lifetime. He also believed, however, that Shakespeare had used these earlier plays by Thomas North for his ideas, his language, and even some of his most famous soliloquies. There was something about a murder involving North's sister and an affair Queen Elizabeth may or may not have had with North's patron, the Earl of Leicester, and a tale of familiar exile uncannily like Prospero's story in The Tempest. I didn't believe any of it. Where are North's plays now, I asked. Lost, McCarthy said, but so were most manuscripts written in the Elizabethan era. Why hadn't anyone discovered this before? Because no one had the right tools to do so, he said, arguing excitedly that his computer-assisted techniques had the potential to finally solve the mystery of how and why Shakespeare's plays were written. I vaguely knew about the conspiracy theories that Shakespeare was a fraud and the plays were really written by someone else, such as the Earl of Oxford. But this was something different. McCarthy's theory was more akin to saying Shakespeare plagiarized or collaborated with another writer. The theory seemed outlandish, but I liked McCarthy and was somewhat amused by the lengths to which he'd gone to pitch me. I promised to look at whatever he sent me. So that's how I begin my book, North by Shakespeare. And the rest of the book traces this journey that I would go on with Dennis for the next 5 years or so. And it alternates back and forth between this story of Thomas North, our journeys together across France and Italy and England in search of the connections between North and Shakespeare, and then the backdrop of Queen Elizabeth and her courtiers and how they may also be reflected in the plays. So I'm going to try and share my screen here and just give you a brief presentation about a little bit about what I discovered in the book. Hopefully you can see that. Give a holler if you can't. Okay, hold on. Still a little bit new at this Zoom presenting, so bear with me. Okay, great. So there is Dennis McCarthy, the rogue scholar that I talk about in my book, and as I explained, I would spend a lot of time with him and really research this idea that Shakespeare had used these works of another writer, Sir Thomas North, as the sources for almost all of his plays. And as I said, when I first was introduced to this idea, I really didn't believe it. I really thought that this was a crazy theory, and I'd never really believed in any of these ideas about Shakespeare not writing Shakespeare. But about 6 months after our meeting, he started sending me material, and it was really incredible to see the research that he had done. And he used these computer-assisted techniques to compare Shakespeare's plays with Thomas North's life and writings, and just found these incredible parallels. One of them, as I talked about in the passage I read, was this manuscript that had never been discovered before that was in the British Library. And it was a treatise on revolution by his cousin, George North. And McCarthy actually ended up publishing a book about it with Juneschluter, my own patron from the Lafayette lecture. And it was well received by scholars, one of whom said that it was the greatest Shakespeare find in a generation, if not generations. This treatise was recognized by many scholars as a source for Richard III, Macbeth, King Lear, Henry V, and a number of other plays. And in fact, I had now been talking to McCarthy for several years, and I ended up writing an article in the New York Times about this under the headline, "Plagiarism Software Unveils a New Source for 11 of Shakespeare's Plays." And my article was also well received by people, and both scholars and lay people. I think a lot of people were just sniggering over the fact that maybe Shakespeare was a plagiarist, but I think the evidence that Dennis presented was very persuasive. However, my article in Dennis's book really only covered that small slice of what he had found, which was this George North manuscript. But there was this whole ocean underneath, or iceberg, I guess is the analogy, underneath of the other findings that he'd made about Sir Thomas North and about how Shakespeare may have used Sir Thomas North's writings, and not only his prose writings, but actually these plays that Thomas North may or may not have written. Before I talk about that, however, I just want to talk a little bit about William Shakespeare. So Shakespeare, as we know, is recognized as the greatest writer in the English language, whether it is the wit of Beatrice or Falstaff, the heroism of Rosalind or Henry V, or the villainy of Richard III, Iago, or Lady Macbeth. Shakespeare has created indelible characters that have survived and spoken to us for more than 400 years. In fact, it's fair to say that no other writer has been reimagined, adapted, parodied, or translated as much as William Shakespeare. It has been said that at some point on the globe, there is a Shakespeare being performed at every moment in time, and that has only been slightly less true during the pandemic when Zoom Shakespeare has become a thing. And Shakespeare is really, I think, the closest that we have to a shared story and a shared culture around the world. He really unites all cultures, all countries, all languages in the enjoyment of his plays. For being such an amazing writer, however, what's surprising in what I discovered as I was researching my book is just how little we know about Shakespeare. Outside of a few biographical details, we know almost nothing about the writer himself. He was born in Stratford upon Avon on April 23rd, 1564. And even that is a little bit of a dubious date because people aren't quite sure, but that's the date that people have assigned. So happy birthday, Shakespeare, yesterday. He was a shareholder in the Lord Chamberlain's Men, a theater company in London at the time. During his lifetime, his name appeared on the cover pages of 15 works, including 13 plays. And his last play was published in 1613, just 3 years before he died. Outside of a few shaky signatures and some legal documents dealing with a couple of court cases, however, that's really most of what we know about Shakespeare, the man. In fact, most of Shakespeare's plays were not published in his lifetime, and they were only published 7 years after his death in the publication of the First Folio. More than half of his plays, in fact, only appeared in the First Folio, and without it, we wouldn't have Macbeth or Antony and Cleopatra or a number of other masterpieces today. The better question about Shakespeare may be, who wasn't Shakespeare? What do we not know about Shakespeare that would have seemed likely for someone to pen these great masterpieces of literature? Shakespeare, according to Ben Jonson, had small Latin and less Greek. He had no college education, did not study the law, had no knowledge of Italian or Spanish or French, so far as we know, all of these languages that were important for the time. There's no records that he ever fought in war or that he traveled outside of England. In fact, that he traveled outside of London or Stratford. He had no contact with the nobility outside of presenting plays at court. There are no records from anyone who knew him personally that he was ever a writer even. And there's no books or musical instruments that appear in his will, which was very common for other writers at the time to pass these down to their family members. And so you begin to see why there's been so many questions about Shakespeare and why there have been these theories that perhaps someone else wrote Shakespeare and Shakespeare was just a front for them. Someone such as Sir Francis Bacon or Christopher Marlowe or Henry Neville or Edward de Vere, the Earl of Oxford, or even a woman such as Mary Sidney or Emilia Bassano, or Queen Elizabeth herself. And so over the years, these number of theories have been put forth to explain just how Shakespeare could have written these amazing works without the requisite experience and background to write them. You don't need to be a conspiracy theorist, though, to know that Shakespeare, whatever you think about the plays themselves, the stories behind the plays did not originate with Shakespeare. Outside of just a couple of the plays, almost every one of the plays originated in a different source. Shakespeare used Italian novellas, he used the chronicles of Holinshed and Hall, and he used Plutarch's Lives, the biographies of Greeks and Romans that was actually translated by Sir Thomas North. And as Bill Bryson said, Shakespeare was a wonderful teller of stories so long as someone else had told them first. In addition, many scholars actually believe that Shakespeare also used other plays to write his plays. And many of these plays have been lost, but we know their titles and we know a little bit about their plots just from historical records. For example, there was a play called Phoenicia, which may have been a source for Much Ado About Nothing. A play called Philemon and Philistia, which may have inspired Two Gentlemen of Verona. Titus and Vespasian and Titus Andronicus, the Jew of Venice and the Merchant of Venice. Even Romeo and Juliet, it's thought, had an original play written decades before Shakespeare's play. And then in addition, there are all of these other plays that we might call companion plays. They're plays that have very similar names and very similar plots and characters to Shakespeare, but they're totally different plays. And there's an open question about whether Shakespeare borrowed from them, they borrowed from Shakespeare, or they were both borrowing from another now lost source. And of course, McCarthy believes in the latter. He believes that Shakespeare used source plays for almost all of his dramas, and that these source plays were all written by the same person, Sir Thomas North. So who is Sir Thomas North? He was raised at Kirtling Hall in Cambridgeshire as a gentleman, as the son of Lord Edward, the first Lord North. He had a brother who was also a noble, and they were both very prominent in Queen Elizabeth's court. He was a translator who translated three major works: the Dial of Princes, the Moral Philosophy of Dio, and Plutarch's Lives, which he's best known for. But he also led this amazingly colorful life where he was trained as a lawyer, he fought as a soldier in wars in Ireland and the Netherlands, and he was a diplomat to France and Italy. So you can see that in just this brief biographical sketch, he had sort of all of the requirements for Shakespeare's plays, which often use very specific language of soldiers in war, or very specific language about legal cases, or deal with the concerns of the nobility and the members of court. But Thomas North also suffered from extreme poverty towards the end of his life. He was sort of disowned by his father and his brother, and he ended up his life extremely impoverished, which might explain, or at least does explain in Dennis's eyes, why he might have sold these works to Shakespeare to be adapted. So the thing that you need to know about Dennis is that he is not your typical scholar. I call him a rogue scholar in the subtitle of the book, and it's really true. He was not trained as a Shakespearean. In fact, he barely graduated from high school and dropped out of college before he graduated. He spent most of his 20s playing ultimate frisbee. He was actually on a championship ultimate frisbee team. And at the same time, however, he was always incredibly smart and one of these sort of self-taught kind of polymaths who just read voraciously and was kind of interested in everything so long as he didn't have to learn it in school. And he ended up actually getting really interested in science, and particularly this science called biogeography, which involves the movement of plants and animal species around the world. And he published his work in scholarly journals in his 30s and actually wrote a book called Here Be Dragons, which was very well received by the scholarly community. And believe it or not, it was this book that actually turned him on to Shakespeare. He had looked at how animals and plants move around the world, but at a certain point, he wanted to see if he could apply the same logic to stories and find how stories moved around the world. And with a sort of maximum amount of hubris, he decided that the story that he was going to look at was Shakespeare's Hamlet. And he was going to trace how it moved from a Norse legend in the 11th century through a French version all the way to the English stage in Shakespeare's first folio edition in 1603. Along the way, however, he came across a reference to another Hamlet play, one of these source plays I talked about, that people only refer to as the Hamlet. And it's referred to particularly in this work by Thomas Nash, who was another playwright and pamphleteer. And he talked about this other writer named English Seneca, who, if you treat him fair on a frosty morning, he will afford you whole Hamlets. And as McCarthy started looking into who could possibly be this English Seneca, he started finding all of these other clues. For example, Nash sort of talked about these translators who vaunt Plutarch's plumes as their own. And as I mentioned, Sir Thomas North is the one who translated Plutarch's Lives. And he talked about getting Boreas by the beard, and Boreas is another name for the north wind. And I won't go through all of the clues that he found, but they all kept pointing to north. They were all puns on his names or references to his translation that seemed to always crop up when people were talking about Hamlet or things about Hamlet. And so McCarthy decided to look at some of North's translations and read them. And about 2/3 of the way through North's Dial of Princes, he found these lines that were sort of a dead ringer for Hamlet's famous soliloquy in the play. Thomas North says, "Is it better that thou die or that thou escape and live?" And Hamlet, of course, says, "To be or not to be, that is the question." Thomas North talks about the assaults of life and broils of fortune, and Hamlet talks about the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. They both talk about a sea of troubles, and they both talk about sleep as a sort of undiscovered country or a pilgrimage uncertain from which no one returns. And just in these passages from North's Dial, he found that he was able to almost reconstruct Hamlet's soliloquy with many of the same words, and many of those phrases that had appeared nowhere else in English except for North and Shakespeare. And eventually he started using this plagiarism software, which is the same kind of tools that professors use to kind of nab students cheating in class. But he used it to compare all of Thomas North's writings with all of Shakespeare's plays. And when he did, it just lit up like a Christmas tree. He found thousands of phrases that were common between the two of them and hundreds of passages, often expressing the same ideas in the same context as Shakespeare's plays. So he really felt like there had to be some connection between the two. Either Shakespeare was totally obsessed with Thomas North and just used all of his writings, or North had indeed written these source plays. You know, it was very expected that he would have found this in the Roman plays. As I said, they're based on Plutarch's Lives. Everyone knows that. But even as you can see in this image from McCarthy's website, the amount of comparisons were just really stunning when you see all this lit up in red here. I mean, it's almost a word for word attempt to rephrase. But it wasn't just the Roman plays. This is a little bit of a clip from McCarthy's website. I realize you can't really read this very well, but just gives you the sense for how many of these parallel passages McCarthy found between North and Shakespeare. And in fact, it was every one of the plays except for two, and it was every one of Thomas North's writings, and even some of his writings that weren't published. So he really felt like there was something to this connection, and that really deserved further inquiry. And what was really amazing was that when he started looking into it and trying to find out, who this Thomas North character was, that it wasn't just the plays that were borrowing from Thomas North's language, but that it was also borrowing details from Thomas North's life as well. I'm just going to give you a few examples here. In 1551, there was a famous murder of a man named Thomas Arden by his wife, Alice Arden. And I have fun detailing this in some detail in the book, but it was really sort of the crime of the century. It was really the scandal of its day. This woman had risen up against her husband and killed him along with her lover. And it was such a scandal that 40 years later, a play was written about it called Arden of Fabricion. And scholars today really believe that this may be one of Shakespeare's very first plays. And in fact, the Oxford Shakespeare now attributes it to Shakespeare. And in addition to Thomas North's sister being the main character in the play, Thomas North's language from the Dial of Princes is all over the play. And I'll just give you one example, which is the subtitle of the play itself, which says, "Wherein is showed the great malice and dissimulation of a wicked woman." And in Thomas North's Dial, it says, "Wherein is expressed the great malice and little patience of an evil woman." And none of these words are put together in any other passage in English. And so it really sort of, again, pointed to this connection between Thomas North's life and Thomas North's writings. In 1555, Thomas North took part in a delegation to Rome that was sent by Queen Mary to reconcile England with the Pope. And he saw these amazing lifelike statues in this weird church in Mantua. And in that same day, he saw these beautiful frescoes by this artist named Julia Romano in a palace that had pagan gods and goddesses at a pastoral feast. And McCarthy learned that Julia Romano is actually the only contemporary artist mentioned by Shakespeare in his plays. And it's in this play, The Winter's Tale, which ends with this climactic scene in which this lifelike statue comes alive. And the statue in the play is made by Julia Romano. And in fact, the Winter's Play also features a pastoral feast with some of the same gods and goddesses in Julia's frescoes. Thomas North, in fact, wrote a journal about his experiences on this delegation. And McCarthy discovered this, that no one had ever known about this before or attributed to Thomas North, and found some of these details in this journal that were then reprinted in Shakespeare's The Winter Tale and Shakespeare's play Henry VIII. And along with Juneschluter, again, he wrote this book that was published this year showing some of these correspondences and just how many there are. Just a couple more examples. Thomas North's second translation was called, as I said, The Moral Philosophy of Dio. And it's really this really weird, funky book where it's all about these kind of animal fables that are sort of have these moral lessons, and they're supposed to tell you kind of as a king or a ruler kind of how best to rule the kingdom. And it centers on this story of this sort of discontented mule who tries to take over the kingdom from this lion. And the way he does it is he's going to turn the lion's lieutenant, this bull, against him. Now, this book was published in Italy, in Venice, and many of Thomas North's biographers believe that he went to Venice to obtain this book in 1570. And what was happening in Venice in 1570? The Turks were invading Cyprus, and they started a war with Venice. And that is the same event that is the backdrop of Shakespeare's work, Othello. And not only is there that connection, but McCarthy identified dozens and dozens of phrases in Othello that stem from Thomas North's Moral Philosophy of Dio that no one had ever noticed before. Here's just one of them. At the beginning of the play, Iago, the villain, is talking about how he's going to bring about Othello's downfall. And he's going to do it by turning him against his lieutenant, Cassio, just the same way that the mule is going to turn the lion against his lieutenant, the bull. And there's some of the same language. So the mule talks about how some animals are just content to eat provender, this just kind of cheap animal feed, and never hope for anything more. And Iago says that same thing to his confidant, Rodrigo, where he talks about some servants are willing to serve their masters for naught but provender. The mule tells his confidant, the ass, that he's not going to write all his thoughts on his forehead. And Iago tells Rodrigo that he's not going to wear his heart upon his sleeve for dogs to peck at. The mule says, tell me not of honesty or dishonesty, tut, a fig. And Iago says, virtue, a fig, 'tis in ourselves that we are thus or thus. The mule talks about committing a double treason. Iago talks about committing a double knavery. The mule talks about leading the bull by the nose, and Iago talks about leading Othello by the nose, just as asses are. So again and again, you see these kind of animal metaphors that are carried into Othello that seem like they're directly drawn from Dio and seem to have no other purpose in the play. As I mentioned in the passage that I wrote, however, the references that McCarthy found in the play don't just have to do with Thomas North and his life, but also has to do with the life of his patron, the Earl of Leicester. And this is a really larger than life character. He was a lot of fun to write about, and especially in his never-ending quest to try and get Queen Elizabeth to marry him. And as I said in the introduction, it really culminated at this sort of amazing festival at Kenilworth in 1575 that scholars see as the really the inspiration for the Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream. And not only were those passages that I read in the introduction sort of reflected in A Midsummer Night's Dream, but there's also references in one of North's translations to this this kind of herb that makes people fall in love with them with each other. And as you know, that's a very prominent part of A Midsummer Night's Dream plot. So again, it's just this combination of the life and the writings that reflected over and over again. In 1580, Thomas North fought in a war in Ireland, which was this sort of hopeless war. It was really this kind of scorched earth campaign, and no one really came out very well at the end of it. And it was started by this Irish rebel named Fitzmaurice, and it's known as the Fitzmaurice Rebellion. And now in Shakespeare's Henry V, he introduces his only Irish character in all of the canon, and it's a Captain Mick Morris, and the English Fitz means son of, as the same, which is the same as the Irish Mac. So McCarthy draws this connection between Fitzmaurice and Mac Morris. And there's all these other parallels where Fitzmaurice was also this sort of demolitions expert who ended up destroying this entire town. And in Shakespeare's plays, Mac Morris is also a demolitions expert, and he also ends up trying to destroy this French town. So again and again, you see these connections. And even Hamlet, McCarthy believes, was partially inspired by Thomas North's life. The Hamlet was written by 1589, and the year before was the invasion of the Spanish Armada, which was this sort of catastrophic event in England where everyone thought that they were going to be taken over by the Spanish. And North played a role in the Armada where it really seemed like he was risking his life, and may explain why Hamlet was so obsessed with death and facing his mortality in the play, at least according to McCarthy's reckoning. So I just want to talk to you a little bit about the book, and then I hope we have some time for questions. But I introduced this idea after I wrote my article for the New York Times of writing this book. And McCarthy had been having such trouble getting his ideas out there, getting any scholar to listen to him about Thomas North. So I said, why don't I write this book? And I will write about your ideas about Thomas North, but also write about what it takes to actually change people's minds, and how knowledge can get changed, and what it takes to do that. But I thought it would be really boring just to have two guys sitting across the table from each other talking about Shakespeare and Queen Elizabeth. So I proposed that we go on some trips together. And it just so happened that Dennis's daughter is a documentary filmmaker, and she's been trying to make a movie about her dad. And so we all kind of joined forces and went together to, as I said, to England and France and Italy, and really tried to set our path in Thomas North's footsteps. Here we are in Kenilworth Castle, which is a ruin you can visit today. It's really breathtaking. There we are at Kirtling Hall, Thomas North's boyhood home. We actually weren't supposed to be there, but I assure you that's public land that we are standing on there. We went to Mantua and saw these amazing frescoes by Giulio Romano, and saw these crazy, weird statues in the Mantua church. And you can see the delight on Dennis's face as he's seeing these for the first time. And of course, we had to go to Venice. Here we are enjoying an afternoon where we traveled across Venice and went in search of Othello and a Merchant of Venice. There's me at the Bridge of Sighs. There's Dennis. There's his daughter and her camera person, Ian. And it was really just a fun way to write the book, but it's also just an amazing experience to go and follow in Thomas North's footsteps and see these places he had seen, and imagine how they might have years later been adapted and found their way into Shakespeare's plays. And I really played around with this idea of us sort of traveling together at the same time, sort of seeing these ghosts in the past, and the interactions between Queen Elizabeth and Leicester and all the other members of the court. In addition to the travels that we took together, though, as an investigative reporter, I wasn't going to take Dennis's words for it, and I really wanted to do some of my own research. And so I spent, I took many trips back and forth to England, but I spent a whole month in July of 2019, and I went to the British Library and the National Archives in Oxford and Cambridge. This is one of the items that I looked at, which was Thomas North's own personal copy of the Dial of Princes, his first translation. And what really amazed me was that Dennis, for all of his computer wizardry, had never gone and actually looked at this book. It's sort of the one flaw in his research technique, is he's so focused on the computers that he doesn't actually go and look at the source material. But lucky for me, I got to go and look at this and hold it in my hands. And as you can see from these images here, that top image, you can see Thomas North's signature and the date 1591, which is when he was making this marginalia in his book. And right away on the title, on the table of contents, he had underlined this passage, the great malice and little patience of an evil woman, and I'd even written it in the margin. It was the only thing he underlined on the whole table of contents. And of course, that is the subheading of Arden of Fabricion that I mentioned before. And so And if you remember, Arden of Fabricion was published in 1592. So here Thomas North is writing this in 1591. But more than that, as I paged through the book, I started finding all these references that seemed to really call to mind Macbeth for me. And I started asking myself, am I just seeing this? Am I just sort of seduced by Dennis's theories and seeing this? But many of them were really striking. He talked about these sort of strange meats that people eat, and lizards and broth and frogs that were fried. And it really called to mind the witches at the beginning of Macbeth sort of throwing the eye of newt and toe of frog and lizard's leg into their pot. But more significantly, there was one other passage that really just sent a chill down my spine, in which North had underlined a number of words and written in the margin, the condition of a wicked man, he is compared to a candle. And of course, that's Macbeth's famous soliloquy at the end of the play, where he talks about out, brief candle, and he talks about life being full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. And if you read that passage that Thomas North underlined, it's all about how a wicked person, once they start doing wicked acts, they never get to the end of them until they burn out just like a candle. And of course, I can't think of a better description for Macbeth in the play, where once he does that first act of killing Duncan, it's just one thing after another, and he just becomes, steeped in blood, as he says, and until he finally meets his final demise. So I sent this to Dennis, and we hadn't even talked about Macbeth before, but he'd already independently theorized that Thomas North had written his source play for Macbeth in 1592, and he started finding all of these other passages in the marginalia, which he thought also related to it. So again, it just, either there's just a series of coincidences, or Shakespeare was really obsessed with Thomas North, or there's something to his theory. In closing, I just want to give a little bit of shout out to Juneschluter, who's this other scholar, who's the one scholar who's really latched on to Dennis's theories, really been persuaded by the evidence that he's provided, and collaborated with him on some of these works, the George North manuscript and the Thomas North Journal. And she really has played quite a significant role in taking Dennis's sort of very enthusiastic prose and converting it into a style that could be actually received and understood by academics, and really deserves a lot of the credit for getting his research out there. As it may not surprise you, however, most mainstream scholars really have kept Dennis at a arm's length for the last 15 years as he's tried to get the word out about this. They have constantly shut him down, even to the point of almost like these really severe personal attacks, which just seemed very unfair to me and really motivated me to try to tell this story and really kind of test this myself as an investigative reporter and put it out there and let the reader decide, is there something to this? And the last thing I'll say is that some people have asked me, what does it really matter who wrote the plays, whether it was Thomas North or the Earl of Oxford or Shakespeare? The plays are the plays. They're these amazing works of literature we've read for years and years. But I can only speak for myself in saying that since I've started talking to Dennis, since I have started down this path of exploring Thomas North's life, it really has changed the plays for me. And I see things in them that have really increased the depth and richness of some of the plays. For example, reading Hamlet, thinking that maybe it's written by someone who was facing their own mortality at the time, or reading King Lear and thinking that it was somebody who was impoverished at the time in the desperation that's sort of undergoing a dark night of the soul. Or even reading Henry V, which is seen as this sort of, jingoistic play celebrating war, and knowing that Thomas North was miserable in his experience of war at the time, and reading between the lines and seeing some of these elements that maybe make Henry V a little bit less heroic than some people have seen him. All of these elements just have really gone into the plays and helped me kind of see them and experience them in new ways. And for that reason, I really encourage people to read my book, to listen to Dennis's theories, go visit his website, and decide for yourself and see if there's anything to this. So thank you all so much for listening to me. I really appreciate you taking the time, and I'd love to answer some questions in the time that we have left.
Thank you very much, Michael. So there are several questions that are sort of about the reception of Dennis's theory. So, and I know you touched on that a little bit at the end. So let me ask Gail's question. Why do you think there's so much pushback by academics that Shakespeare may not have written all of these?
Yeah, it's a great question. And what's really fascinating to me is that when he sort of put out a part of his theories, people have been really excited about it. So when he puts out the George North manuscript, or even when he just puts out some of these verbal connections and says that, Shakespeare may have used Thomas North's writing as a source, he's gotten a lot of interest. But as soon as he says Thomas North wrote all of the source plays, it's like this incredible shutting down. And it's almost like, and there's a real kind of personal vein to it. You see I've read some of these, peer reviews that he's gotten on some of the papers that he's submitted. And it's almost like, how dare you, how dare you take this Shakespeare, this genius that we all know and love, and imply that maybe he wasn't solely responsible for these plays. And I think that it comes down to two things. One, which I sort of have sympathy over, is that a lot, scholars have sort of based all of their life and work on this one image of Shakespeare, and it's really hard to get people to look at things differently. And the other is, I think, a little bit less sympathetic, which is just this kind of emotional attachment that we have to Shakespeare and this image of the Bard of Avon that I think really gets in the way of maybe seeing these plays as a more collaborative work, and is something that we should explore.
One of the questions mentions two Shakespearean scholars, Shapiro and Greenblatt. So are those, which I have to admit, I'm not familiar with them.
Sure.
But I'm hoping you are. Are they are as well not supporting these theories?
Well, Stephen Greenblatt, interesting enough, has actually been pretty cordial to Dennis. And I think that's because Greenblatt's whole method is looking for kind of traces of Shakespeare's life in the plays. And some of Dennis's method has been looking for Thomas North's life in the plays. So I think that at least there's kind of a similar approach, that they've actually had some fruitful conversations. James Shapiro, who many people know is the author of the Year of Lear and 1599, has been completely hostile to Dennis, is one of his greatest detractors, and really will not even give him the time of day. So you get to see just this incredible range of responses that he's gotten.
And there's a question about cultural fallout from colleges and universities. Has there been any fallout from those sort of institutions, or it's just that the scholars are not even bringing it into the schools?
Yeah, they're not even addressing it, and I think that's why I wanted to write the book, was just to get it out there to an audience that was maybe not so invested in the scholarly interpretation of Shakespeare, and who could look at it with a more open mind, as I did, and look at the fact that it's very well known that Shakespeare used these source plays. So how much further of a leap is it to think that some or most of them were written by this other writer? But no, the universities won't touch it. Most of the scholars, won't even address it.
So there's a question from Louise. If there had been no Shakespeare, would anyone now know of the stories in North's plays? Don't we have Shakespeare to thank as, pardon the parallel, the Walt Disney of Elizabethan England for bringing the stories in North's plays to life?
Yeah, it's such a great point. And this is something that Juneschluter says a lot, is that she doesn't believe that this takes away from Shakespeare's genius at all, that Thomas North was probably writing these plays for a more courtly audience that were presented, to the Queen, and were more kind of drawing room dramas, and that Shakespeare may have been the one who was really responsible for taking these kind of old plays and presenting them in the public stage, and adding some of the comedy and some of the slapstick humor, and as well as maybe other elements as well that really made them more palatable to a general audience, and really gives that mix that we know today of the real high highs and the real low lows of all of Shakespeare's dramas. So this is, I think there's room for both, and I think, for me anyway, that's what's so exciting about this theory, is that it really makes sense to me. Whether you want to use Walt Disney, I use the analogy of like Peter Jackson and The Lord of the Rings, that J.R.R. Tolkien wrote these amazing books, but without Peter Jackson's movies, the broad populace would not have been exposed to them, and it really adds so much to them to see them on the screen. So it's very possible that that's actually how Shakespeare and Thomas North are also related.
And for the people who disagree or are skeptical about this theory, what is their explanation? I mean,
yeah,
we saw a lot of parallels. There's a lot of evidence that you just showed us.
right.
So how is that explained?
The biggest pushback that he gets, well, there's really two things that he gets, but the biggest one is people say, where are these plays? He's found a few references that suggest that Thomas North may have been a playwright, But even that, there's really no kind of hard and fast evidence that he was a playwright in addition to being a translator. And so they say, you're just making up these plays out of nowhere, and there's no evidence that they ever existed. And of course, Dennis's response to that is, well, most manuscripts of the Elizabethan period are gone and have been lost. In fact, we only have about 10% of them, and there's like another 10% that we even know their names. So in some ways, it would be more surprising if these plays did exist than if they didn't. But that's the biggest thing, is they say, you're making this up. The other thing that people say is, well, these parallels you're finding are just coincidental. They're just, we don't know all of the other works that were out there at the time that have been lost, and maybe these parallels that you're finding with the plagiarism software aren't so special and aren't so common. And Dennis's response to that is that it's not just these parallel phrases, but they're actually in these passages that actually are in the same context or have the same meaning, or it's more than just, these phrases themselves. But those are the two things that people really push back on. And I think that could be where the argument could be over.
So I think I have time to just ask one more question, and I know, so John has one here. So he states it as: man of Shakespeare's time and place, 300 to 400 word vocabulary. Shakespeare's plays, 21,000 word vocabulary. What gives?
Well, that's a good question. And I think that also is, as I said in the beginning, is one of the things that makes people believe that maybe Shakespeare wasn't sort of, a Glover's son from Stratford, that he was university educated, and that, or whoever wrote the plays was university educated and had this background and this rich life experience and all that. So I think that is one more thing that points to just, this idea that there's something more to Shakespeare. And whether you believe entirely that North wrote all these plays and Shakespeare adapted them, I leave it up to you. But I at least feel like there's some connection here that we should really be looking more into. So, but thank you for all the great questions. I really love this audience.
Yes, thank you so much, Michael. I'm afraid we've run out of time, but I really appreciate your joining us again. You're a festival favorite, so thank you for coming back with this new book. And thank you to our audience. This was great. I loved the presentation, and it's great to get so many questions from everyone.